still hear me?
Yes.
Clearly?
Hello, everybody. I think we're all here. Thanks for your patience with us, and good evening. My name is Amy Pozorski, and I am Professor of English and Director of Graduate Studies at Central Connecticut State University. We thank you for attending this second event in the Lit Talk series and look forward to 3 excellent readings by 3 brilliant poets and thought-provoking discussion to follow. Thank you to Jotham Borello for curating the Lit Talk series. When Jotham invited me to organize a reading on the topic involving trauma and medicine, I thought immediately of Michael Broder and of our past representation in poetry. I thought at the time what you must all be thinking today, and what Alexander put into the words just this past weekend to the New York Times. America's response to the coronavirus pandemic seems painfully familiar. As she states, this virus is not that virus, but this country is still that country. The series is called Lit Talks not only because it allows us all to talk about literature. These are, after all, talks about literature, if nothing else, but also because it recognizes that literature itself speaks. Even literature itself seems to refer to the present day. After giving Michael Broder just a few days to rally around this idea, he has generously connected all of the folks on this panel. This is one of his greatest gifts. Thank you, Michael. I'm so happy and honored to introduce you to Denzel, Sylvia Scott, Risa Denenberg, and Michael. But first, I'd like to recognize our generous sponsors, the Connecticut Literary Festival, the CCSU Foundation and Department of English, Real Art Ways, R.J. Julia, Yale Writers Workshop. Thank you for keeping us all going. Now the part you are waiting for. I will introduce the poets one at a time. After a brief introduction, I will turn the floor over to that poet, and then we will hear from that poet reading, and then I'll introduce the next poet, and we'll go on from there. Following all 3 readings, I will ask a few discussion questions to continue the conversation, and then I'll turn it over to all of you. So please ask a question in the Ask a Question box in the middle of the screen. And we'll continue discussing via your questions as well. So now to Denzel Xavier Scott is a writer who earned his BA in English from the University of Chicago and received his writing MFA at the Savannah College of Art and Design. His prose and poetry appear in various literary magazines, Rattle, Empty Mirror, Spillway, and many others. Denzel, I'll turn the floor over to you. Is he still on the call?
He is.
Okay. Denzel, are you on with us? Maybe while we're waiting for Denzel to join us, can we go to our second reader, Risa, and then we'll circle back to Denzel, if that's okay. So Risa Denenberg lives on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State, where she works as a nurse practitioner. She is a co-founder and editor at Headmistress Press, publisher of Lesbian by Trans Poetry. She publishes poetry book reviews at the Rumpus and other venues, and curates the Poetry Café, an online meeting place where poetry chapbooks are reviewed. She has published 3 full-length collections of poetry, most recently Slight Faith with MoonPath Press 2018. Risa, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, good. So I wrote some poems during April, during the one a day, write a poem a day month that I usually participate in as we were going through the COVID, and this is kind of what came out of that month. So they're pretty new poems. The daisies have returned. It's happening again, not as metaphor, more like natural science. First daffodils, then irises and tulips, the magnificent orange poppies, and now this. I wonder if person blossoms will return in time, sprout new seed legs from subterranean roots, or rise like helium balloons trampled in a crowd. I've cried every day this month. Forget about summers, June weddings, senior prom. See how blueness performs itself in sky? It's now, and daisies are exploding everywhere. I love daisies. This is ER Doc Dies in Husband's Arms, and it is dedicated to an ER doc who died of COVID, and Frank Gabrin. And it was a headline in the New York Daily News for 1/20, and it appeared in Michael's HIV Here and Now series. Streets are empty like you always wished when you lived here. That month or so of summer with no tourists. If you could bear the ruinous aroma of subway stations, lofty buildings split sun rays into angel wings, while we long for a sudden shower to cool things down. The city where my friends died in droves in the 80s. Back then it was jam-packed with yellow cabs and Doc Martens and Keith Haring images. Bistro patrons spilled onto sidewalks at noon, sipping Bloody Marys. Sounds of yowling sirens, blaring hip-hop, what do we want demos, funeral dirges. Today, the city burns with fever, spews sputum. Nurses protest, clutching photos of dead colleagues. The next poem is called Bedside, and it's really dedicated to nurses everywhere, but particularly the nurses who've been on the front line during the pandemic. Bedside. To wake each morning and recommit to what you've chosen. To grab a cup and a donut, to gown up, reuse your N95, add goggles and gloves, to hear the call bell, to be a hand reaching out to say, stay, to watch the struggle and then the surrender, to notify the family, to embrace the phone while they sob, to not cry as you remove the tubes, to cleanse the body as tenderly as you would if she were your own mother. To cover her with crisp white sheets, to fall into a moment of groundless grace, to feel desperately alive. My gift to you will be an abyss, and this is a line from a poem by Roberto Bolaño. The title is a line from one of his poems. The lights blew. I hadn't paid the bill. Or I had paid, but the transformer was out of order. I don't know the correct word for this shutdown, but I'm too weary to Google a thing I can't remember. It was morning and evening on the 100th day. This is a slow event made of bread. I'm making do, but there's nothing left for you. There are days I've wished for a gun. I stay here alone in darkness waiting for medicine, for commerce, for the landlord to call back, for my wife's test to return. Someone you know might die today. I have only enough light left to pray for my people. Death revised. Although you can't be certain and there's no palpable sign, there will be a moment, a hush, a lilt, something inchoate, a sigh like breath, but not breath, radiance like body, but not body. When a chasm wraps the mantle of his bed and presence bleeds, flesh to liquid to smoke. Ever after you will evoke him, once glamorous and wretched, now a body stilled, his cold hands nestled in your warm ones. Oh, how an easy death softens grief. It may be augured by a foghorn or an eyelid quiver. And to know yourself again, you must thread this moment with other moments, ones you thought to have forgotten, goodbyes you didn't get to say, a thoughtless last message, an unanswered email, the anguish as you sort papers and belongings, knowing someone, somewhere, right now, is dying alone. This is cul-de-sac. Morning fog seals the inlet with soft sibilance. Across the bay is a town with normal lives. I've been alone too long, and I can't scrub the image of the EMT cuddling his body like a rag doll, then layering him down gently on the hardwood floor beside the bed. Strangers rushed into the street in bathrobes to stare at the spectacle. A girl rambled on about how he owed her something. A morose dog licked my shin. I gave my name to the cop. I told the story start to finish. I checked for pulse, for breaths. My lips kissed his lips. I counted 1, 2, 3, all the way to 30. All the other houses on this cul-de-sac are vacant now. Everyone has gone to the town with normal lives. Morning fog sheathes my home like a flock of sheep, grazing in sagebush, waiting for governance. And this is my last poem, How to Grieve, and I've sort of styled it after 1 Corinthians 13, the love verse that you may know. Grief is patient. A day will come when you'll sit with torn shirts on low stools beneath covered mirrors chanting Kaddish. Some morning you will offer oolong tea to the bodhisattva sitting calm and cross-legged at the altar. Today you may refuse to take the body of Christ into your mouth, but tomorrow the wafer will dissolve into tears. Grief waits as we stare out the window. The lingering taste of ash reminds us how she hovers. You may curse again and again, but she keeps her counsel. When Zoom makes me sit alone in a room, waiting for the host to open the gates and admit my ghost, it reminds me of the time when I was 5 and made to stay behind, alone on my nap mat, while the other children ate ice cream at the playground. Do we always remember the punishment but not the crime? We may behold many marvels today, but the greatest of these is grief. Thank you.
Thank you, Risa. Is there a snap function on Crowdcast? Thank you. Denzel, this is me hugging you. I'm happy to see you. Are you ready to read now? I can read the last line from your bio. His prose and poetry appear in various literary magazines, Rattle, Empty Mirror, Go Away, and many others. Denzel, you there?
There we go.
Yes. Denzel, you're on.
My poem is Hot Ivory Vision, HIV. Beam down with such intensity, hot ivory vision, that I scream out, I am changed. The world is changed too. The world is changed and should have been made more kind, more cautious, more contemplative, and wise. And yet, a new wonder shines in an impossible future that is here now and thus present. When once upon a time, more than once actually, this world was supposed to die, burn, explode, murder itself in frenzy, but did not. Humanity wasn't supposed to be here, and yet still we are. Hot ivory vision, you failed to murder humanity. We suffer and still die in the millions to this day, but we are legion. We are billions, darling. You cannot kill us fast enough. And with this new wonder of today that dances from nation to nation, that drives us away from hugs, kisses, and other delights, that reveals some of our world leaders to be ghouls, deprived of beating hearts and blood-warm skin, and others, imbeciles, missing vital cerebral matter, or worst of all, some combination of both, as 1 million dead, left breathless from devoured lungs and burnt out bodies becomes inevitable. I am left bewildered in a hedge maze. Hot ivory vision, you attempted to change this world. You killed the vulnerable, the hated, the disenfranchised, the reviled, the children of the outside, God's least favored. And then you revealed that you were mounting your assault against all of humanity from the very start, and not too long ago. So I must ask, how does this new, terrible wonder curse this world much the same, appearing to stretch first amongst the least favored, while of course equally stretching amongst the most favored? And yet the world acts dumbfounded, caught up in horror and awe. Our plagues laced with the gifts of Lethe, running quiet in the underworld. Why do so many not remember?
Thank you, Denzel.
Of course.
The 1 million
I wish I
dead
could
is
see you all, but
I wish we could see you. The 1 million dead is really powerful. It's hard to believe that was days and days ago already. So I have questions for you, but first I will introduce Michael Broder, our third reader. And here is his bio. The author of This Life Now, a Midsummer Night's Press, 2014, a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award for gay poetry. He is the founding publisher of Indolent Books, a small nonprofit poetry press. He edits the online poetry projects HIV Here and Now and What Rough Beast. He lives in Brooklyn with his husband and several feral outdoor cats. This is Michael.
Hello, thank you, Amy. And thank you, Risa, and thank you, Denzel. And yeah, I'm much more comfortable these days as an editor and a publisher, but I guess I'm going to be a poet now. So I'm not sure how many, I have a few things here, and I also have a couple of pieces tucked away from other poets from the HIV Here and Now series that we did in April for National Poetry Month. But I that's just like backup. We'll see. And I also was sort of with my pieces trying to sort of stick with, well, first of all, poems that were finished and not draft. None of these are really finished. And also things having to do with like the idea of HIV and COVID and trauma. So some of these are really, a couple of these are kind of are pre-pandemic, but they kind of fit in with the theme. So I've been doing a poem every morning for like since last September, but I never revised them. So most of them are not really ready for prime time. This one was kind of close, and it is from earlier in the pandemic. They're all called First Thing in the Morning, because that's the idea of how they're written. So this is First Thing in the Morning of April 13th, 2020. You sip your coffee, you take your meds, you feed your kitties, you check your email, your social media. You used to get straight to coffee and your poem. Now you are far more distracted. Now, before you write your poem, you check the headlines. Cannot start your day without knowing yesterday's death toll. If a new clinical trial started treating patients with an investigational drug. Listener's Daily Press, live streamed on Facebook or watched later if you miss it. It's your Mr. Rogers. It's your fireside chat. One of your backyard feral cats looked sickly and then stood off and looked at dinner but did not eat and then just did not come back. You assume he's dead. That's how they do it. You've seen it before. And it has nothing to do with the pandemic, and yet it seems to. Everything that happens during this time, a new TV show you start watching, a book you read for a few minutes at bedtime before your Ambien kicks in, everything seems to be COVID-19 edition. Everything seems connected to you like the term health crisis, which nobody seems to use. That's what they called AIDS, the health crisis. Then you were marginalized and the federal government dismissed your plight. Now you have marriage rights and characters in TV shows, movies, and stage plays, and the federal government fucks everyone else right along with you. Plus ça change. This piece is called, well, it's an excerpt from a longer piece called When Two Men Love Each Other Very Much, They Cathect Each Other Narcissistically. I'm reading the drama of The Gifted Child again, which I first read 30 years ago. I think my Gestalt psychotherapist may have turned me onto it, as she turned me on to Louise Hay and to Power Animals. It sounds like I'm making fun, but I'm not. I really loved Louise Hay, and still do. But it's hard to love her in the same way now, when she's dead, and I listen on YouTube to a digital copy of the audio cassette I used to listen to 30 years ago. The one that came with your copy of You Can Heal Your Life, that Sandra, my therapist, gave me the day I came to her office and told her I had just tested HIV positive. She gave it to me right off her own bookshelf, saying she always kept one handy in anticipation of the day when a client would need it. Louise Hay took a lot of shit from the AIDS community, by which I mean mostly the gay, white, male part of the AIDS community, because people with AIDS thought she was blaming people with AIDS for getting AIDS. I see their point and I understand the pain and anger they felt, but I don't think Hay deserved the shit she got. Her idea was that we create our own illnesses as a way for our bodies to tell our minds how fucked up we are, so we can do something to change it. It's meant to be empowering, but in the context of AIDS, many people thought Hay was blaming the victims, and we gay white fags with AIDS already had enough of that shit being dumped on us without our favorite metaphysical healer piling on. You see that? How I get to say we in that line, not as a matter of identification, but as a matter of identity. I was one of them. I was one of those gay white fags with my HIV diagnosis and my 12-week support group at Body Positive and my copy of You Can Heal Your Life and my cassette tape of Louise Hay saying, no matter what the problem is, the solution is always loving the self. And that helped me a lot. It didn't give me more T cells or less virus, but in 1990, I may have needed self-love more than I needed T cells. When Louise Hay said to see fear as a black cloud attached to my wrist with a string, and to cut the string and watch the black cloud of fear float away into the sky, higher and higher until it was just a tiny speck, and then I could not even see it at all. That helped me. When Louise Hay said to picture myself as a child, lonely and crying, and to comfort that child and to make that child very small and put it in my breast pocket close to my heart, and to imagine my mother the same way, and my father, and to put all three of us together in my pocket, close to my heart, where I could give them lots of love, that helped me. So this is getting long. I think I'm going to close with this poem called I'm the Boy Who Lived, which I believe was written in October 2019. We were watching Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, and I got choked up and teary-eyed when McGonagall told Harry, you're the boy that lived. And I thought about myself, gee, you're being sappy and sentimental. And then later, when we paused the movie for the night and I was in the kitchen loading the dishwasher, I realized, oh, wait, I'm not choking up and teary-eyed because Harry Potter is the boy that lived. I'm choked up and teary-eyed because I'm the boy that lived. I'm the boy that did not get aborted when my mother thought she was too old and had too little money to raise a child. I'm the boy that survived allergies and bronchial infections. I'm the boy who got HIV 6 years before they had effective treatments. I'm the boy who got tied up at knife point and burglarized in his own apartment by a crack addict I was paying for sex. I'm the boy in my own apartment by a crack addict I was paying for sex. I'm sorry. I'm the boy who just 4 months ago mixed edible pot with painkillers and muscle relaxants, got really high, drank too much water, and by morning called 911 to take me to the hospital with depleted electrolytes, altered mental status, and tachycardia that could have killed me. I'm the boy that lived. I'm the boy I was crying for. I'm the boy I was grieving. I'm the boy I didn't take good enough care of. I'm the boy I'm teaching myself to love. Thank you.
Michael, those were stunning. You said you'd rather be an editor or publisher, but you read with joy. You are a poet, a performing poet. So I have some questions I think that will work with everybody. Michael's, one of his first poems started with, you sip your coffee, you take your meds. And so that has me thinking about how the three of you use address in your works. Denzel's poem addresses HIV itself, which is really provocative. Risa has that powerful line, someone you know might die today. And Michael also has another poem called Atonement that has the repeated line, I blame you. So I'm wondering, as for the three of you as poets, is it a conscious decision to use the you, the second person you, to address a specific, maybe reader, maybe the virus itself, maybe a nemesis?
Oh, are you posing that to me first?
I'm posing that to you first, Michael.
Okay, it's interesting. It's a very apt question, and it fits in with the poem, with some of the poems that I read. And also, you mentioned that poem Atonement with I blame you, and the you is my husband in that poem. Or I think you've sometimes I've read some of your writing about that poem, and I think you might I forget, but it's also possible that that poem could be seen as sort of speaking to the virus potentially. But it's that's addressing my husband. And in those days, I used to mostly, I'm a classicist by background and doctorate and so forth, and so it was very influenced by like Sappho and Catullus and other classical Greek and Roman lyric poetry, and that was usually addressed to a beloved, and that's kind of how I started writing poems. But like the you in You Generally Sip Your Coffee or whatever, the one that I read for tonight, I decided when I started doing these poem first thing in the morning poems that I had kind of lost my voice. I don't write that. Well, I hadn't written that much poetry in years. And I thought, you know what? The you thing always worked for me. So I'm going to start using that again, but I'm going to be you. Mm-hmm. And so every morning, like the first word is often you. Because every morning I sit down in front of the computer and start, okay, just you what? You sip coffee. You hear the clock ticking. And try, so for like, since last September, I've been trying to get me back by addressing me as you. So I'm not sure how much that answers your question, but
it does.
It's really about like using a you to create an intimacy, in this case, trying to create it with myself. But I think that when poets do that, they're often trying to create a connection with whoever the you is.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I imagine myself also sipping coffee, taking my meds, right? Like I am now in your world.
Right. Brings the reader in, potentially.
So I was hoping Risa could also, is Risa back on? We lost Risa, I think, and Denzel at the same time. So you're on the hot spot a little bit, Michael, until we get back.
There's only two of our little squares there.
I know.
For all of you folks watching this.
But I'm hoping that, so this is also kind of tied to Denzel, who talks about how the virus kills the vulnerable, hated, the disenfranchised, the reviled. And you wrote in a note to us that you were kind of thinking about how the coronavirus seems to affect everybody. It's kind of this global condition. But then you put a little footnote on that in this other poem you read tonight, which I had not seen before, which is, and now the government fucks everybody else. So I'm wondering what you think about that, about these poems that focus on the disenfranchised communities affected by COVID on the one hand, and then on the other hand, understanding this argument that COVID affects all of us. You've heard that before. We're all in the same boat. We're all in this together.
Yeah, I was really struck. I mean, as the pandemic was unfolding, and I know that a lot of people with HIV and in the HIV community kind of thought about the parallels. But the big difference is that, or a big difference is, well, there's a number of big differences, but a big difference is that, HIV was connected with like risk groups, gay men, people of color generally, but specifically, people of color often, because of various factors, as we're seeing now with the COVID-19, with the coronavirus pandemic, disparate access to healthcare, disparate access to information about prevention, or whatever the case may be, whether we're talking about HIV or talking about COVID, injecting drug users and so on and so forth. Risa, if you can hear, we're talking about like the differential, the inclusivity of COVID-19, maybe compared with HIV. And so nominally, COVID-19 is like affects everyone. I don't know, it's just been really interesting to me how like, you'd think that would create, like HIV actually created community, or AIDS created community around itself. And so you think, okay, so maybe if this is a virus that affects everybody, then it'll bring everyone together with a sense of community. But I don't really see it that way. So I haven't quite figured that out yet, but there's a way in which like AIDS by hitting risk groups, like brought the risk groups together. I mean, there's a really famous speech that an ACT UP activist made in the late 80s or early 90s, in which he called on the fags and the junkies. That's Greg Broder I'm referring to, the fags and the junkies to come together because they had a common enemy. And that sense of people coming together for a common enemy, you'd think we'd be experiencing that now, but instead we're divided into red and blue states and all of that stuff. And there's reasons for all of that. But anyway, Risa, what do you have to say about this?
Well, maybe we can,
yeah.
Well, we can start.
There are, can you hear me?
Yes.
There are groups that are more likely to be affected by COVID. They're not very cohesive. They're the elderly. They're also people of color. It isn't an, equal opportunity disease. It really isn't. There is, some coordination amongst, seniors, but it's, the thing about this disease is you die quickly or you get better. It's a very different disease. And the deaths are horrific. That's the same. The deaths were horrific with AIDS. The overwhelming the healthcare system, which I'm very tuned into as a medical provider, has just been horrific. And we've been asking people to do all these things that are making them very unhappy for good reasons. People are out of work. They don't have money. They don't know what to do. They're also being idiots in some ways. But we're asking people to do that so that the healthcare system won't be overwhelmed and the elderly can be taken care of. It's a big ask. At the same time, I wasn't in New York, you were. Maybe you could tell us what it was like. I mean, I'm out here where we've had very few cases in my little rural community. I was in Seattle, I'm near Seattle. Seattle was kind of the first hot spot. We're sort of a cooperative state, and people have been very good about distancing and masking. And so the period during which the healthcare system was overwhelmed was shorter. Much shorter than in New York, and we're having some upswings now, but our healthcare system is okay. And I think I don't know if people caught on to that idea that the reason we needed to flatten the curve was to protect our healthcare system. And when you get to that point, maybe you can help people understand that our healthcare system is absolutely bankrupt, and people don't have healthcare. You know, you think of all the people that have been, unemployed, that lost their healthcare. So it's different. You know, there's some commonalities, but I think there are a lot more differences.
Risa, you have that line, someone you know might die today, and I was wondering about that as you were speaking. Is that for you as a healthcare worker? Is it for healthcare workers? Is it for all of us? We all might know somebody.
Well, I think it's more true of COVID, just because of the greater general population that's susceptible to it. Yes, absolutely. I wish people got that. You know, they might go out, and party, or to a demonstration, which I fully support. To a party, not so much. My grandkids are 20 and 17. I mean, they've been miserable. My both of them missed their graduation ceremonies. Can you imagine being a senior and not having any of that? But people can go home, and 85-year-old grandma 70-year-old grandma can get COVID and die. Someone might die. And I think that's across the board. It's not my patients. My patients die all the time. I live in a senior community. They're the old people who would die if they got COVID. They're, the elderly.
So in terms of language, I'm wondering if that works similarly. So language you use in COVID poetry, is that a thing? I don't know if it's too early to call that a genre. And AIDS poetry, do you see parallels in terms of language being used or strategies being used to address mortality or ethics or governmental response? That was a question from the audience.
That was a question what?
From the audience.
From the audience, okay. Maybe we can both take that on. I know that I do have something to say about that. So as an editor/publisher, I'm reading, I had 450 poems in my submittable queue at one point. It's down under 200 now.
Wow.
But I've read so many poems and COVID poems because I called for them specifically. Mm-hmm. And I think it is a genre at this point. And there are certain things that show up a lot, and some of them make me very angry. Risa, I really want to hear what you have to say about some of these things. The invisible enemy. I swear that phrase comes from Trump. Unless I'm missing something, right? And it was all part of his strategy to excuse himself, make excuses for himself. Well, it's an invisible enemy. And people have really picked up on that. And I'm sorry, world, especially poets. I won't put anything that's the invisible enemy because I read it. And then this is like the sort of medical writer part of me coming out. And I go, it's not an invisible enemy. It's no more invisible than war, poverty, racism, right? It's not an invisible enemy, especially when there are pictures of the virus all over the internet. It's not invisible on any level. We can see the virus itself if we want to, and we can see people getting sick and dying. There's really nothing invisible about it. So there are a number, I can't actually think of any others off the top of my head, but there are a number of tropes about the pandemic that come up a lot in poems that kind of drive me nuts. But you know how ordinary I am anyway, so maybe that's just me. But I'm interested in what you have to say about that as a reader, as a writer, as a, in whatever guise.
Did we lose Denzel?
I don't see him. I would love to hear what you have to say about that too. Christiana tells me it's not too late. We can get him back.
Okay. Yeah, it took me a while to get back on when my internet disconnected. I think that it's way too early to be writing COVID poems, and yet I wrote them, and I infused them with COVID language, 95 and this and that. the medical language that I tend to use anyway. It's too early to know if we have a COVID, a bank of poetry for COVID. We definitely do for AIDS, and that has survived over the decades since the decades that we were really a community fighting AIDS, which we're not anymore. Although ACT UP has a page on Facebook fighting COVID, which I find very interesting and very hopeful, and doing the thing of looking at this new medication and that new medication, and I'm very impressed. I'm an old hospice nurse, and I tend to think death is, going to happen. I'm looking at it as death, and I'm so glad other people are looking at it, looking for a cure, in a reasonable, in realistic way. And I trust the information that I'm getting from that group. I don't think we have a poetry of COVID yet, although I've submitted poetry to people who've asked for it. And I've submitted some of these poems to a request for COVID poetry, and I kind of COVIDed them up a little bit in revision. And that was kind of fun, to make them more, I knew what they were about, but they could also be about COVID. Mm-hmm. And that, that made for a metaphor, and so that was interesting.
I have a question about how medical language works throughout these poems. But before I ask it, I wanted to invite the audience to ask a few more questions if they had them, so it doesn't seem like I'm monopolizing conversation. But you both have mentioned medical language. I know that Michael writes for body.com. Risa, obviously, you are a medical practitioner. Is there a place for medical language in poetry? And conversely, for Michael, what is the place of poetic language in these medical journals, which I love? Michael, do you want to go first with that?
Can I just say that the most thrilling acceptance? Oh, I'm sorry. I just wanted to say the most thrilling acceptance I ever got was getting a poem in JAMA, in the Journal of the American Medical Association. I mean, there's such a place for poetry in medicine, and poetry has enriched medicine, and doctors, nurses gain by having access to poetry. But both of these diseases, AIDS and COVID, we've learned a lot of language. I mean, the general population, people who had AIDS in their life, learned all kinds of, we're in the hospital all the time, and we're at home doing IVs and, doing all the things that we think nurses do. This is a little different because people are so separated from the ill, but there is some language that has crept into the general. I want to say too, in terms of invisible enemy, it's also not an enemy. It's not just not invisible. It's not an enemy. It's a virus, mm-hmm. And it's part of our world. And, I'm not saying I like it, but it didn't come here to harm us. It's just a virus.
Yeah. I really have, for most of my poetry life, I haven't really been interested in using medical or, virologic terminology. And I know some poets do and have, and maybe because I was also making a living in medical communications, I really didn't want to do that. I wanted to keep everything I wrote about HIV and AIDS really personal and about relationships and, fear and rejection and loss and anger and all of those things. I do find people, I don't really see a lot. I said one of the other things that I get frustrated about is the extent to which people, not people, it's fine if they don't know about science and medicine. I get really frustrated with the level of coverage by the media. So for example, there's I think a popular investment in a vaccine. Everybody wants a vaccine. And I see this kind of echoed in the media, and I see this echoed in various kinds of discussion. And I think that's so old-fashioned. I mean, a vaccine will be great, but we have antiviral medications now in a way that we didn't 30 or 40 years ago. We could potentially have a preventative medical approach to this, to COVID, that's not a vaccine, but nobody talks about that. And again, it's not really that important for poetry, but for our lives, it's like we've advanced a lot in the past 30 to 40 years in terms of what we can do with viruses. But popularly, we're still kind of stuck in this model of who's going to come up with the vaccine. And it's almost, people may think of, polio vaccine. My husband and I often think about Star Trek, where, something is making the original Star Trek, where something is making the crew of the Enterprise, age, Spock and Kirk and McCoy, they're all turning into old men before our eyes. And then in the last 5 minutes of the show, Dr. McCoy battles through the disease itself to come up with a vaccine. And then in 30 seconds, they're using their needleless hypodermic to give it to everyone on the ship. And then in 30 more seconds, everyone's cured. And I feel like that's the popular understanding of how vaccines work. And I don't know. I feel like there's so much more interesting stuff going on now, but there's not a lot of discussion about that. It's so limited, I feel.
Your reference to Star Trek had me thinking about Richard Hartese's poem about the final frontier. I forgot the title of it, but I haven't read it since the beginning of the COVID crisis. I bet it's uncanny in its way. Yeah. So you both kind of talked about your relationship to writing about trauma and illness through poetry. And so I wanted to kind of give a shout out to one of our CCSU students, or she's graduated now, Jennifer Lavoie, asked Michael one time a question about poetry and its ability to bear witness. And of course, that's language that comes from trauma theory and also narrative medicine. And so that led Michael in the past to kind of talk about how poetry allows us to experience empathy, and maybe based on that empathy, it'll move us to action. So I guess I'm asking because here I am sitting in a room on Zoom. I love that Risa's line about what happens if you put me in a room on Zoom. Kind of wondering what we're doing here. Are we making a difference? Is there this kind of ethical potential for writing poetry, talking about poetry that leads to action, that leads to making a difference? Doesn't have to be a vaccine, as Michael said. What can coronavirus or kind of AIDS poetry do?
I see Risa going away again. Come back, come back.
Risa's fading away. I'm wondering if it's on purpose.
No, I don't think so.
She just, I don't know.
So,
Can you not see me? I'm here.
I hear you. Do you want to answer first?
I was just going to say, does poetry do anything?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure how to parse that. I mean, it's almost like people think it's supposed to do things. It's supposed to make people more empathetic. It's supposed to make people more in touch with their feelings. It's supposed to make people more erudite. And I don't think that when we write poetry, that's why we do it. I mean, we're not trying to cure people of their problems or their not having empathy. On the other hand, poetry does everything. It does everything. It informs and it educates and it softens and it hardens and it makes people think and rethink and maybe change their minds if they're receptive to it.
Michael, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I think that when I talked to Jennifer about that, and when I have talked about it back in the days when I was first starting the HIV Here and Now project, and I did get interviewed a number of times about it, that I think poetry doesn't do that much in the really strict a sense of doing something, but that it does help shape the way people understand things, whatever the thing is. And that can be a very big contribution. And like one of my sort of obsessions with this HIV Here and Now poetry project has been to try to get people, I always say, poets can be able to write about anything. And yet I find that HIV is an area in which people are a little scared sometimes, because if they write an HIV or AIDS poem, it might implicate them in some way that they might not be comfortable with. And for years, I've been kind of saying, like, dive in, think about a celebrity who died that means a lot to you. Think about, I don't know, like find a way in, because I think that that's a way, I think that so this is really addressed more to writers than to readers, that, see if you can find a way into this topic the way you would, war, poverty, hunger, natural disaster, racism, injustice, etc. And I do find that that's very challenging for a lot of people who aren't sort of by community and identity and history kind of brought into HIV and AIDS. And I'm not sure if that applies to coronavirus and COVID at all. I think that is a way in which people feel like it's everybody's property. And I feel like with AIDS and HIV, people felt like it was only some people's property in terms of like creative and intellectual.
So when you talk about inspiring poets to find a way in, that acknowledges the fact that I think we're all self-conscious about representation, about putting words down, putting words to the page. What if it doesn't sound right, or what if it doesn't capture the truth? And so that leads me to another audience question, which is, have you seen adequate or effective or convincing representations in theater and film and poetry and literature that speaks to the AIDS crisis? That's the question as it stands. I guess it's a little, I wanted to extend that to COVID-19, but it might be a little bit soon for that. So maybe we'll just start with adequate representation of HIV/AIDS. Risa? I saw Risa go.
The thing that brings to mind that is a connection between the two infections and the two health crises is the demonstrations. And people aren't out on the street demonstrating because of COVID, but they're out on the street demonstrating because everything is wrong, because of racism and because of systemic racism. And when we talk about representation, I always just think of those ACT UP marches and the gay pride parades and being in shorts because it's never hot out here. And, I wrote some poems in the 90s when I was in New York City. I'm going to read them later on the Headmistress Press poets that are reading kind of later today. And I wrote them in the 90s. And the thing that I was struck by, may not be connected at all, but I was really struck by how everything was informed by sex. And there was such an intensity of sexual desire and need and acting and doesn't really connect to COVID, but the representation of sex in language, the representation of also just being with, learning how to cope with an ill friend, learning how to cope with your best friend dying, learning how to cope with your partner dying, learning how to cope. And people are in COVID, go back to this point, which is in one of my poems, people are not, this is tragic beyond all measure, the grieving that's going to need to happen for people who didn't get to say goodbye or who didn't get to see the person at all, dropped them off at the emergency room and were called by the nurse some days later saying sorry and meaning it, but it doesn't, I mean, a peaceful death is really a gift, and AIDS deaths were not peaceful, and these deaths are not peaceful. Representation, I'll throw that back at you.
I love what you're saying about that, Risa. And so for example, you mentioned sexuality and sex in so much HIV/AIDS poetry. Yes, and interestingly, not. And as you're saying.
Did we lose him?
Michael's frozen. Oh, it's so dramatic. What's he going to say?
Dramatic pose.
We have one more minute. I wish I could anticipate where he was going with that.
I do too.
But one of the last words he said is one of the last words you said, which is kind of representation. That I feel like as a critic, that's one of the things that I'm just so fixated on when I kind of talk about these difficult texts with students. That's the number one question: what is being represented? How is it being represented? And so often we have all of these kind of multiple interpretations of saying the same word or the same phrase. And I find that one of the most beautiful aspects of poetry generally, but certainly of this difficult poetry that you are writing, Risa, that Michael is writing, that Denzel is writing. So I believe we are out of time, which is so unfortunate. We can't say our formal goodbyes to Michael or Denzel. But Risa, this is the first time we've interacted, right? I feel like we are friends now.
Yes.
Forever. So
and Michael, wherever you are, it was good to see you.
Michael's been a friend.
Denzel, it was great to meet you.
And if Denzel, if you are listening, we'll catch you again very soon. So we're at the end of our hour together.
Well, Amy, you've done a great job too. Amy, you've done a great job too, because the glitches, just every time I've done one of these things, there are glitches, and you just smoothed it out. It seems like you did a great job with this.
Thank you very much. You're professionals. It was so fun to work with you. Michael, do you want to finish do you want to have the last word before we wrap up?
Not necessarily. The only thing I was going to say was that it's interesting that HIV-related poetry was so much about trying to have connection, and especially sexual connection, is despite, and how now with COVID, the emphasis is so much on how we can more effectively stay separate. And I just find, I'm not expressing it that well and we're out of time, but there is something interesting about the difference or the comparison and contrast between how the two diseases have sort of made people think about being together or being apart.
Yeah, absolutely. There's an essay there about connectivity, physical connections, internet connections to Washington State and Brooklyn, New York. So thank you very much for being so classy. I also want to thank Jotham and Christiana Torres, our self-described tech pixie of production. The next Lit Talk is July 2nd at 7 p.m. Daniel Donahue will moderate a panel discussion with Marilyn Nelson, Frederick Douglass Knowles II, Antoinette Brim Bell, and Jose Gonzalez. And you can register for that online, the same place you registered for this event. So with that in mind, thank you very much. Stay safe and well. Keep reading, keep writing. You've been great. Bye, everyone.